In mid-1955, psychiatrist Ian Stevenson, then a research associate at the University of Virginia, was receiving European reports for his survey on spontaneous memories in children. Among them, one stood out, that of a 6-year-old British boy, Wilfred Robertson, residing in Notting Hill, London. The family was middle class. The father worked for the postal service. The mother, Margaret, was a nurse's aide. There was no significant psychiatric or religious history. The initial detail that caught attention was an intense aversion to the sea, which was unusual in the British cultural context. The first clinical record emerged through a colleague of Margaret's who described the boy's behavior to the researcher when faced with mentions or images of the ocean, crying, trembling, and phrases with technical content disproportionate to his age. "The deck is flooding, the ropes are loose, close the hatches." The family had no contact with sailing. The boy had never been to the coast. During his first home visit, Stevenson recorded reactions and language using neutral terminology, avoiding interpretation. He observed that while playing with wooden blocks, Wilfred spontaneously assembled a rudimentary ship model and named parts with precision: mainmast, rudder, stern, bow. When questioned about the origin of this knowledge, he replied, "I worked on one. It was my ship, but it sank." The content was recorded on magnetic tape and transcribed. The observation routine was designed to maintain a natural environment and reduce suggestion. The sessions took place at home, with the parents present, and no nautical materials in sight. Stevenson recorded times, stimuli used, and behaviors. In a simple test, upon reproducing the sound of the sea on a portable recorder, Wilfred exhibited acute panic and verbalized emergency orders typical aboard a ship, asking to close the lower compartment doors. The researcher noted the incompatibility between these responses and the boy's life experience. The basic biography was verified: school, routine, access to media. There were no books, magazines, or radios with naval content at home. No relative had worked in ports. Stevenson tentatively classified the case as an anomalous memory with an aquatic thematic phobia, determining the need for documentary verification in naval archives. In March 1955, Wilfred was invited to draw The Ship from Before. The sketch showed 2 masts, a raised deck, and a side funnel elements compatible with British cargo ships from the early 20th century. Stevenson attached the drawing to the medical record with the observation, "Technical coherence higher than expected for his age." The family began recording nighttime episodes. In a note dated April 14, 1955, the father described, "He woke up at 2:13 a.m. saying there was a fire in the engine room and an order to abandon ship." Based on these clues, fire, flooding, partial evacuation, Stevenson planned to cross-reference data with ship losses between 1910 and 1930 in Lloyd's records. The case was assigned the code Elon 55R and included in Stevenson's preliminary catalogue of European studies. From this point on, the objective was defined: to test for a specific historical correspondence between the boy's descriptions and a documented shipwreck. In the following weeks, Ian Stevenson focused his efforts on documentary verification. His principle was clear: no hypothesis should be considered before the confirmation of concrete data. In May 1955, he consulted Lloyd's Register of Shipping in London, searching for records of British vessels that exploded or sank between 1910 and 1930, with circumstances compatible with Wilfred's descriptions: fire, flooding, and partial abandonment of the crew. Among dozens of records, one occurrence caught his attention: the SS Cartonia, a merchant ship built in Glasgow, specializing in coal transport, which sank in the North Sea in April 1917 after an explosion in the engine room. The report from that time mentioned an intense fire and rapid flooding. The crew consisted of 32 men, 19 of whom died. One of the deceased was named William Robertson, a native of Liverpool. Stevenson noted the coincidence in his diary, but maintained caution. Identical names were common in Great Britain, and the similarity between Wilfrid and William Robertson could not be considered evidence. Still, the researcher recorded, "The overlap of context and technical terminology warrants further investigation." Returning to the Robertsons' home, he simply stated that he was researching old ships. Without mentioning names, he asked if the boy remembered anyone on board. Wilfrid replied without hesitation, "Will Robertson. That was me. I knew where the coal compartment keys were." The phrase was spoken in a neutral tone, as if describing any ordinary memory. When Stevenson asked him to repeat it, the boy added, "It was fast, I didn't feel the cold." These statements were recorded and archived on magnetic tape. Stevenson observed that the boy showed no signs of delusion or exaggerated fantasy. He spoke coherently without improvising stories. Neither parent encouraged him. In fact, they showed discomfort with the topic. In June, the psychiatrist obtained a copy of William Robertson's death certificate, stating, "Explosion followed by fire as the cause of death. The body was never recovered." This absence, Stevenson noted, created an emotional gap in seafaring families that, in certain cultures, fueled the belief in the continuity of consciousness after death. Determined to deepen the study, Stevenson sought the sailors' descendants. Through correspondence with civil registries in Liverpool, he located a great-nephew of the crew member, who confirmed family details. The man described his uncle as reserved, hard-working, and meticulous with boiler maintenance, characteristics compatible with the boy's technical remarks about valves, smoke, and compartment keys. The relative also recounted a curious habit. William used to carry a copper medallion with the vessel's number hanging in his uniform pocket. Stevenson recalled that, in one of the sessions, Wilfrid had mentioned a metal disc that was in the pocket, a detail the researcher recorded as a relevant but not conclusive coincidence. Throughout July and August 1955, the observations continued. Wilfrid described fragments of the routine on board: smell of oil, wet ropes, sound of the wind. When Stevenson showed him unlabeled photos of different British cargo ships, the boy pointed to an image and said, "That was mine." The sound of the engines was the same. The photograph, Stevenson noted, corresponded precisely to the SS Cartonia. Even faced with the precision of the coincidences, the researcher maintained his scientific stance. It is not about proving reincarnation, but about understanding a memory that finds no conventional explanation. The case was becoming complex and would require from then on longitudinal follow-up, prolonged observation, control of suggestion, and systematic comparison with historical records. At the end of August 1955, Ian Stevenson formalized the Elon 55R case file, gathering recordings, drawings, transcripts, and copies of documents obtained from the British Naval Archives. The objective, according to his notes, was to ensure total traceability of the data, avoiding any reliance on oral recollections. He believed that the strength of a case lay not in its strangeness, but in the verifiability of the information. The sessions with Wilfrid Robertson continued at home, always with the parents present. The boy was calm most of the time, but still reacted with panic to the sounds of running water. When questioned, he would only say, "It's rising. The water is rising." Stevenson, experienced in child psychiatry, did not interpret the statements as delusion, but as reactivated traumatic memories. In one of the September sessions, Stevenson presented the boy with a didactic ship model used in technical schools. The reaction was immediate. Wilfrid correctly identified parts of the structure. "That's the front deck. The rudder is there. And the fire came from below, in the engine part." The researcher observed that the vocabulary corresponded to that of merchant navy workers, not to children's books of the time. The nighttime reports gradually decreased. The mother recorded each episode, following Stevenson's guidance. In the notebook dated September 28, 1955, she wrote, "He woke up saying the captain told everyone to go up, but the lifeboats were full. Then he went back to sleep, and in the morning didn't remember anything." Stevenson interpreted the repetition of these images as a form of emotional discharge, similar to what he would later call mnemonic decompression, a process in which the act of recalling reduces the intensity of the repressed emotion. The hypothesis was that the fear of the sea might represent a residual trace of traumatic memory. To test the stability of the account, Stevenson conducted spaced interviews, comparing answers given weeks apart. He found that the narrative remained coherent, with no addition of new elements or variation in details. This temporal consistency has since become one of the criteria for authenticity adopted in his future studies. In parallel, the psychiatrist maintained contact with the great-nephew of William Robertson, the sailor who died in the SS Cartonia shipwreck. He received an old photograph and a copy of the crew list from him, confirming the position of deckhand. The document was attached to the main file with the observation, correspondence between reported function and the subject's spontaneous verbal content. At the end of October, Stevenson conducted a final interview for that observation cycle. He asked Wilfred what he felt when talking about the ship. The boy replied, "It's less now. When I talk, the fear goes away a bit." This response caught the researcher's attention, who noted, "Verbalization seems to have a therapeutic function. The phobia decreases as the memory organizes itself." Upon concluding the in-person follow-up, Stevenson drafted a provisional report for the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, in London. In it, he classified the case as an outstanding example of spontaneous memory with verifiable elements of historical correspondence. Without attributing a spiritual interpretation, the document was archived with the original tapes under the designation Case Lon 1955 WR. In the following months, the boy continued to progress. Reactions to the sound of water diminished, and sleep became stable. Stevenson ended the direct observation stage, but decided to monitor the development through annual correspondence in order to document the long-term impact. For him, that boy from Notting Hill represented more than a curious account. It was a model case of correlation between emotional memory and historical data, capable of expanding the understanding of the limits of human recollection. In 1956, Ian Stevenson returned to the United States carrying the material from the Lon 55R case, magnetic tape recordings, drawings, interview transcripts, and authenticated copies of the British Naval Archives. His first step was to technically verify the data collected in London. Through correspondence with the Public Record Office and the British Shipping Federation, he confirmed the information about the SS Cartonia, a ship built in 1909 in Glasgow with 2 steam boilers and a capacity of 1,800 tons of coal. The sinking occurred at 2:17 a.m. on April 2, 1917, after an explosion in the engine room, resulting in fire and sinking. The official reports, obtained directly from a naval inquiry in 1917, described the same conditions mentioned by the boy: fire, flooding, and hurried abandonment. The coincidence of technical terms, lower compartment, hatches, loose ropes, was classified by Stevenson as linguistically significant, indicating the use of precise nautical vocabulary, unusual in a child with no contact with the sea. This cross-referencing between spontaneous speech and historical record was the central point of the report Stevenson sent to the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, in London at the end of 1956. The 27-page document described the methodology step by step: direct observation, control of suggestion, spaced interviews, and documentary verification. In the summary, Stevenson stated, "The case does not constitute proof of reincarnation, but demonstrates the existence of memories whose origin cannot be explained by conventional avenues of learning." The report was archived and presented in a summarized version at an internal SPR meeting in the fall of 1957. The reaction among the members was divided. Some of those present praised the methodological rigor. Others considered the case interesting but insufficient for metaphysical implications. The context of the time was marked by post-war skepticism in British psychology, which viewed reports of previous memories as the product of childhood fantasy or family suggestion. Stevenson, however, maintained that rejecting without examining was incompatible with the scientific method. In a letter to biologist Alistair Hardy, he wrote, We must observe before theorizing. The absence of explanation does not authorize the denial of the phenomenon. Back at the University of Virginia, Stevenson began including the Robertson case in a comparative database of spontaneous memories. By 1960, this collection would gather 44 cases from different countries, including India, Burma, and Canada. Wilfrid figured among the best documented Western examples precisely because he emerged in a cultural environment without a predominant belief in reincarnation, which, according to the researcher, reduced the possibility of suggestion. In his reports, Stevenson highlighted three main aspects: the technical accuracy of the descriptions about the ship and the disaster, the coincidence of the name between the boy and the sailor, the gradual reduction of the phobia after the verbalization of the memories. The sum of these factors supported, in his view, the hypothesis of an extra-cerebral memory, that is, a recollection that does not originate from the individual's current experience. Even so, the author kept his distance from religious interpretations. On the clinical level, Stevenson observed that the fear of the sea decreased as the boy talked and drew about the shipwreck. This relationship between recollection and emotional relief was documented as evidence of a process of psychic integration, anticipating concepts that decades later would be recognized in trauma psychology. In his 1958 diary, Stevenson recorded, "Each time the memory is expressed, the emotion loses intensity. The recollection transforms into narrative and the fear into understanding." At that point, the case ceased to be merely an enigma and became a methodological model, a basis for future comparative investigations. Between 1958 and 1960, Ian Stevenson organized his growing database of spontaneous memory cases, consolidating LON 55R as one of the most consistent examples in the West. The documentation of the boy Wilfrid Robertson served as a reference for the protocols he would later apply in his investigations in Asia. The psychiatrist identified in it all the elements of a solid case: temporal coherence, absence of cultural reinforcement, and verifiable documentary evidence. During this period, Stevenson prepared a final report on the case, maintaining a technical and descriptive tone. He avoided the term reincarnation in a conclusive sense, preferring expressions like anomalous memory or extra-cerebral recollection of information. However, he acknowledged that the coincidences, name, profession, type of death, and technical vocabulary, formed a pattern unlikely to occur by chance. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "The absence of explanation does not authorize dogmatic skepticism. The data persists and must be recorded." The 1960 report, published internally at the University of Virginia, highlighted that no member of the Robertson family had received any benefit from the study. Wilfrid's anonymity was preserved, and the parents maintained privacy and cooperation throughout the process. Stevenson emphasized the boy's stable behavior with no signs of delusion, dissociation, or psychiatric disorders. The final part of the document focused on the emotional response. The fear of the sea, which previously caused panic, had transformed into a sensation of moderate discomfort. Stevenson interpreted this change as the integration of traumatic memory, a process in which the repressed content becomes conscious and therefore loses emotional force. He noted, "Gradual exposure to the memories has a therapeutic effect. The content, previously uncontrollable, becomes recognized and therefore dissolved." From then on, the psychiatrist reduced his visits, maintaining only follow-up by correspondence. The letters exchanged between 1961 and 1963 show that Wilfrid was attending school normally, although he still avoided water play. The mother reported, "He no longer cries at the sound of rain, but he doesn't like to go near the water." In the scientific community, the case remained restricted to specialized circles. Only in 1962, during a seminar on memory and identity at Harvard, Stevenson briefly mentioned the London boy, describing him as an example of recollection not attributable to direct experience. The presentation aroused curiosity among psychiatrists and philosophers of mind. One of the participants noted in his diary, Stevenson speaks with clinical precision, but doubt is the engine of his conviction. Meanwhile, in London, Wilfrid was progressing into adolescence. According to follow-up reports, the nocturnal crises had completely ceased by age 12, and he could now view images of the sea without panic. Stevenson classified this evolution as the closing of the mnemonic cycle, the point at which the recollection ceases to affect behavior and integrates into current consciousness. In his 1963 notes, Stevenson highlighted the therapeutic value of the case. Understanding dissolves fear. The process of remembering is, in itself, a treatment. This episode came to occupy a prominent place in the researcher's archives, not only as evidence of anomalous memory, but as a demonstration that spontaneous recollection can have a healing function. At the end of 1965, the case was revisited as Stevenson prepared his book, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, published 2 years later. Although he chose not to include Wilfrid's real name, the case was cited in the drafts under the title London Boy, Maritime Memories and Aquatic Trauma, and served as the basis for the methodological format adopted in the work. The Robertson case had ceased to be merely a clinical curiosity. It had become a model of rigorous observation, a study in which memory, trauma, and history met under the disciplined gaze of a scientist who refused to dismiss the inexplicable. In 1966, Ian Stevenson revisited the Elon 55R file while preparing the final version of 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. He wanted to evaluate how much the London Boy's case had contributed to the development of his protocols for control and verification. The original notes, made more than a decade earlier, showed a pattern of rigor that would become the basis for all his subsequent work. Stevenson observed that Wilfrid demonstrated descriptive consistency even in interviews separated by weeks, a detail that led him to standardize the requirement for temporal repetition in his subsequent studies. This constancy, combined with the historical correspondence of the data, justified the use of the case as an example of memory of a non-ordinary nature. In the Lloyd's Register archives, updated in 1966, Stevenson definitively confirmed the details of the SS Cartonia. The dimensions, the number of masts, the type of boiler, and the anchoring model were exactly what the boy had described with technical terms: rudder, hatches, coal compartment. The researcher added in a note, "The precision of the structural elements exceeds any possibility of incidental learning. The source of the knowledge is not identifiable." During that year, Stevenson began a series of lectures at British and American universities, where he presented the Robertson case as an example of thematic recollection associated with specific fear. He explained that, unlike complete narrative accounts, this type of recollection emerged fragmented and accompanied by persistent phobia, dissolving only when verbalized. When questioned about possible external influences, Stevenson always emphasized, "There is no evidence of environmental reinforcement." The boy lived in an urban area with no maritime tradition. The family had no books, films, or relatives connected to the sea. These conditions reinforced the uniqueness of the case. Around the same time, the psychiatrist noticed something that had previously gone unnoticed. The gradual disappearance of fear coincided with the increasing clarity of the memories. As Wilfrid managed to describe the episode in more detail, the physical symptoms, tachycardia, sweating, tremors, decreased until they ceased completely. In a 1967 report, Stevenson described the process as spontaneous integration of traumatic memory. The case was also decisive for the methodological structure of the book 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. Based on it, Stevenson created the cross-checking forms, the criteria for controlling suggestion, and the systematic use of independent testimonies. These procedures would be adopted in all his later work and would become the standard for the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. After the book's publication in 1967, the scientific community reacted cautiously. Some academics recognized the value of the method, others classified the conclusions as speculative. Even so, Stevenson's name began to circulate among researchers, interested in phenomena of anomalous memory and trauma not explained by current life events. Wilfrid, in turn, was going through adolescence with emotional stability. His mother reported in letters that her son maintained a mild aversion to water, but without panic. He began to be interested in mechanics and engineering, demonstrating an affinity for metallic structures and engine operation, a coincidence that Stevenson recorded only as curious but not conclusive. In 1969, Margaret Robertson wrote to the researcher, "He says the sea is just a distant sound now." Stevenson replied briefly, noting on his own copy of the letter, "The memory has integrated. The content has lost emotional force. The cycle is complete." The case of Wilfrid Robertson, therefore, represented for him not only a study of unusual recollections, but a model of longitudinal observation in which the phenomenon was followed until the extinction of the symptoms. From this point, Stevenson consolidated one of the conceptual bases of his career, recording the inexplicable without turning it into belief. During the 1970s, Ian Stevenson's name became synonymous with rigor in the study of spontaneous recollections. The case of the London boy, filed under the code LON 55R, served as a recurrent example in his lectures as a demonstration of controlled observation in a non-religious context. Unlike the Asian cases, where the concept of reincarnation was culturally accepted, the British environment offered a neutral scenario which reinforced the scientific value of the material. In 1971, Stevenson presented a lecture at the American Psychiatric Association in Washington, titled "The Child Who Remembered the Sea." The content was based directly on the notes and tapes of the Robertson case. Before an audience of skeptical clinicians, he described the procedures adopted, the temporal coherence of the accounts, and the rigorous control of suggestion. He ended with a sentence that would become a reference in his future lectures. "The phenomenon must be recorded, regardless of the observer's belief. What is repeated with consistency deserves study." The impact was immediate. Even critics acknowledged that the psychiatrist treated the subject with objectivity and prudence, without mystical appeals. Shortly thereafter, the transcript of the lecture was archived at the University of Virginia and distributed at symposia on experimental psychology. In the following years, Stevenson began collaborating with European universities. In 1974, he presented the seminar Memory, Identity and the Continuity of the Self at the University of Freiburg in West Germany. There, he again cited the case of the London boy as an example of trauma associated with thematic memory. The German audience reacted with caution, but recognized the methodological value of the study. The journal Zeitschrift für Parapsychologie und Grenzgebiete der Psychologie published a technical summary under the title Ein Londoner Kind mit Erinnerungen an das Meer, a child from London with memories of the sea. Stevenson insisted on maintaining an empirical focus. In 1976 correspondence with Swiss neurologist Hans Luthi, he wrote, "Reincarnation, if it exists, is just one hypothesis among several. What interests me is the mechanism of recollection without cerebral registration." This balanced positioning strengthened his reputation among researchers from different fields: psychology, anthropology, and philosophy of mind. He was seen not as a defender of beliefs, but as a scientist documenting phenomena outside the known standard. During this decade, the Robertson case began to be cited in academic articles dealing with the relationship between memory and trauma. Stevenson introduced the term spontaneous integration to describe the disappearance of fear as the repressed content became conscious. He argued that the recollection, even if inexplicable in its origin, followed observable psychological laws. Meanwhile, Wilfrid was already a young adult. According to correspondences maintained with his mother, he lived discreetly in London, studied at a technical school, and avoided the sea but without suffering. In 1978, Margaret reported, "He can now walk near the river. He says the sound of the water doesn't bother him." Stevenson recorded the letter in the file and noted, "The phobia has disappeared. The event was assimilated. The case has reached complete resolution." From this point on, the Robertson case consolidated itself as a methodological reference. In internal reports of the psychiatry department at the University of Virginia, it was classified as a Western base case, used in courses and debates on anomalous psychology. At the end of the decade, Stevenson published articles comparing the London case with investigations conducted in Asia. The behavioral similarities, specific phobias, technical knowledge, and coherent narrative indicated that the phenomenon followed patterns independent of culture or religion. This reinforced his argument that the origin of the memories should be studied as observable data, not as belief. The presentation of these results at international symposia marked Stevenson's transition from an isolated researcher to a global reference in studies of consciousness and memory. The Robertson case, quiet and discreet, had become one of the central pieces of this change. In the early 1980s, Ian Stevenson was already a respected, albeit controversial, figure in international psychiatry. The Wilfrid Robertson case, Lon 55R, continued to be one of the most cited examples in his lectures on anomalous memory. The researcher was now seeking to integrate his observations into broader debates on neuroscience and trauma psychology. Between 1980 and 1982, Stevenson reviewed the physiological records made during Wilfrid's sessions in 1955, comparing them with recent data on psychosomatic reactions. He observed that, during panic, the boy exhibited tachycardia and sweating, symptoms now recognized as typical of implicit memories linked to traumatic experiences. The psychiatrist noted in a report, "Even without conscious awareness of the event, the body responds as if reliving it." The auditory stimulus reproduces the context of the trauma. These analyses brought the Robertson case closer to emerging fields of psychology, such as the neurophysiology of fear and studies on post-imprint trauma. In correspondence with colleagues at the University of Freiburg, Stevenson acknowledged that the mechanisms of mnemonic evocation can operate outside the reach of conscious memory, but still within the physiological system. In 1982, the University of Tübingen held the symposium Sprache und Erinnerung, die Grenzen des Bewusstseins, Language and Memory, the Limits of Consciousness, where an entire panel was dedicated to the Robertson case. Researchers presented linguistic analyses of the original tapes, highlighting the correct use of nautical terms and grammatical coherence compatible with adult technical language. No errors typical of childhood learning were identified. At the same event, the philosopher Karl Renz synthesized the impact of the case by stating, "Stevenson did not prove reincarnation. He proved that doubt can also be scientific." The phrase would be reproduced in several academic publications in the following years, symbolizing Stevenson's stance: record without affirming, investigate without denying. While the academic debate advanced, Wilfrid lived in silence. Now an adult, he worked as a maintenance technician and led a reserved life. In 1985, his mother sent Stevenson a short letter. He no longer talks about the ship, but sometimes when he hears the sound of the wind, he becomes thoughtful. He says he feels like he's remembering something that isn't his. The researcher replied only, "The memory may become quiet, but the trace remains. The important thing is that fear no longer dominates him." Between 1986 and 1987, Stevenson prepared the collection European Cases of the Reincarnation Type, in which the Robertson case was given its own chapter. He described it as the best documented Western example of thematic memory associated with trauma, emphasizing that the goal was not to prove reincarnation, but to demonstrate the need to recognize data that escape traditional models of the mind. During a conference in Berlin in 1987, Stevenson concluded his presentation on the case with a direct observation: "There is no room for faith here, only for recording. Science progresses when it decides to look even at what it doesn't understand." The audience remained silent. Among those present were psychiatrists, linguists, and theologians. Many disagreed with the philosophical implications, but few contested the methodological value of the study. At that point, the case of the London boy had already surpassed the realm of curiosity. It had become a historical landmark in consciousness research, remembered as one of the first examples where an apparently impossible phenomenon was treated with traceability, neutrality, and scientific ethics. For Stevenson, this was the true legacy. The goal had never been to prove spiritual theories, but to expand the boundaries of scientific observation of human memory, even when it manifests outside the expected. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Ian Stevenson had already accumulated thousands of pages on anomalous recollections. The Elon 55R case, even though old, remained among the most consulted in his collection. He considered it a starting point for comparative studies of phobias and spontaneous memories in children. In 1993, in an interview with the Journal of Scientific Exploration magazine, Stevenson mentioned the case briefly. A boy in London, in the 1950s, demonstrated technical knowledge about a shipwreck he never lived through. It's not proof of reincarnation, but it is proof that the mind records experiences through pathways we do not yet understand. This statement set the tone for his final phase as a researcher: objective, cautious, and focused on observable data. In the following years, Stevenson initiated a statistical review of 2,500 cases collected worldwide. Only 3 showed characteristics similar to Wilfred Robertson's: memories linked to maritime accidents in children with no prior contact with the sea. This rarity reinforced the methodological value of the London case, now treated as a reference category within the archive of the Division of Perceptual Studies, DOPS, at the University of Virginia. Concurrently, the correspondence between Stevenson and Margaret Robertson continued until 1995. In the last recorded letter, the mother wrote, "My son is leading a quiet life, married, no children. He says the sea is just background noise now." Stevenson replied, "What was once a painful recollection has become merely a neutral memory. The mind seems to heal itself through understanding." In 1997, he published Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect, a work that expanded his hypotheses on the transmission of extracerebral information. In it, he cited the Robertson case as an example of psychophysiological continuity, arguing that the body can react to memories that do not belong to the current life. Wilfred's clinical notes, tremors, sweating, tachycardia, were described as evidence of implicit body memory. At the turn of the 2000s, Stevenson was still giving lectures, always insisting on the distinction between belief and method. In a conference at Oxford in 2000, he presented the case under the title Childhood Memories of a Maritime Death. At the end, a psychology professor asked if he believed in the survival of the soul. Stevenson answered calmly, "I am not seeking to prove the soul. I am seeking to understand the data. If memory persists beyond the body, science must follow it, not deny it." Even with his health failing, he personally reviewed the transcriptions of Wilfred's recordings. In 2005, he recorded a final observation: "The recollection does not need to be explained to be respected. The data precedes the theory." When Stevenson passed away in February 2007, at the age of 88, his archives totaled more than 2,000 volumes and 3,000 recordings. The file of the London boy, identified as Wilfred Robertson, Elon 55R, Fear of the Sea, remained intact in a metal cabinet at the University of Virginia. A few months after his death, a team of researchers recatalogued the entire collection. Among the tapes was Wilfred's voice, recorded at age 6, saying, "The ship isn't sinking anymore." This simple sentence, recorded half a century earlier, symbolized the closing of a cycle, not just that of an individual memory, but that of a lifetime of research dedicated to understanding how memory transcends the boundaries of time and biography. After Ian Stevenson's death in 2007, the vast archive of his investigations officially passed into the custody of the Division of Perceptual Studies, DOPS, at the University of Virginia. Among the thousands of archived volumes, the Elon 55R file, referring to the boy Wilfred Robertson, remains preserved under controlled temperature conditions. The grey boxes contain the original tapes, drawings, letters, and handwritten notes of the researcher. the case attracted renewed interest when, in 2012, psychiatrist Jim B. Tucker, Stevenson's successor and director of DOPS, mentioned the episode in a public lecture. He described it as material of great methodological value, highlighting the ethical care and documentary precision of the study. Tucker reinforced that Stevenson's goal was never to prove reincarnation, but to investigate the relationship between memory, identity, and consciousness, a question that modern neuroscience is still unable to resolve. In the following years, part of the archive was digitized in partnership with the Institute of Noetic Sciences, allowing the Robertson case to be analyzed with contemporary tools. Researchers identified linguistic and emotional patterns consistent with current accounts of implicit memory and childhood trauma, confirming the relevance of the data. In 2018, during a Society for Scientific Exploration conference, British anthropologist Peter Fenwick commented, "If all anomalous phenomena were treated with Stevenson's rigor, the boundary between science and mystery would be less hazy." Meanwhile, the Robertson case remained almost unknown outside academic circles. It was only in 2019, when the original tapes were digitally restored, that a small group of researchers gained access to the full audio. The recording reveals a child's breathing and a faint voice saying, "It's dark, the noise comes from underneath." Then, just the wind. The simplicity of these words reignited the fascination with the case, not because of the possibility of reincarnation, but because of how a spontaneous childhood account could reflect a trace of traumatic memory still not understood by science. In the 2020s, researchers at DOPS and European universities began to reinterpret the case in light of new concepts of neuroplasticity and transgenerational memory. The predominant hypothesis is that traumatic experiences of previous generations may influence emotional responses in descendants, even without conscious recollection. Although it does not fully explain the phenomenon, this approach showed that Stevenson's work anticipated lines of research that would only gain scientific validity decades later. The London boy, whose real name remained preserved, passed away in 2003 at the age of 54 without ever seeking exposure. He worked as a railway technician and, according to his mother, kept his distance from the sea, but without fear. In his last correspondences with Stevenson, he said he vaguely remembered the childhood dreams, but without feeling anything. Today, 70 years after the first interviews, the Robertson case represents a landmark in the history of consciousness investigation. It shows that science and mystery are not opposites, but parts of the same quest for understanding. Stevenson's rigor transformed an isolated account into an enduring scientific document, still consulted by researchers in psychiatry, philosophy, and neuroscience. In one of the last handwritten notes found in his archive, dated 1989, Stevenson wrote about the London boy. "As long as there is a recollection without an origin, there will be work for reason." This phrase summarizes the spirit of all his work, the conviction that observing with honesty is more important than explaining with certainty. And that is why, among the recordings preserved in Charlottesville, the voice of a child can still be heard saying that the ship stopped sinking. A simple sound recording that decades later continues to challenge the silence of doubt and to remind science that the inexplicable is also part of reality.